Was 120 years ago today that my great-grandfather participated in the land run in Oklahoma in 1889 and homesteaded. And on that day, you had people from all over the country going to a new land, what had been Indian territory, to start anew. Now, that, granted, was 120 years ago, and the situation was much different. But we have had a situation in Clarkston, we have seen in Clarkston, Georgia, where people from around the world, different cultures, have come together to find a new life in a new land. And Warren St. John has done a wonderful service, I think, in documenting the way the community has been able to come together and show that melting pot really is the thing that this country is made of and can congratulate itself for. So please join me in welcoming Warren St. John.
And told a few friends what I'd seen and said, am I crazy? Is this interesting to you? And they had more questions, just as I did. And so I began to look into Clarkston, Georgia, and try to understand what was happening in Clarkston. Big question, of course, is how did so many people from so many places around the world end up in a little town east of Atlanta? And it turned out that many residents of Clarkston had been wondering the same thing for quite a while. And this was interesting to me. Clarkston ended up being this kind of complicated social experiment that no one really planned on. No one intended it to happen. And very simply, the reasons for resettlement in Clarkston were that resettlement agencies, when they're looking for places to resettle refugees and help them get a toehold in their new lives in this country, look for places with cheap housing. They look for places that have access to public transportation. They look for places that are near economic centers that can support jobs for these newcomers so that they can have a shot at economic self-sufficiency. And little Clarkston fit the bill perfectly. You really couldn't have designed a sort of better community for resettlement on those terms. And so the refugees began coming from Southeast Asia in the late 80s, and it was a trickle. And then because it worked, the numbers continued. And before too long, and before many in town realized what had fully happened, the town had, according to the 2000 census, about a third of the residents were foreign-born. I think pretty much everyone in Clarkston thinks that was a low estimate. And this struck me as fascinating. How do you make that work? Clarkston High School, when I was reporting in 2006, had students from 50 different countries, over 50 different countries. How does a teacher make that work? How do police handle that situation? How do the residents themselves find any sense of commonality across these extraordinary cultural divides? And as I learned more about Clarkston, I began to realize that it was a sort of, all of this together was a kind of reporter's dream. It was a story about the hopes and aspirations of real people in a place that was undergoing radical change. And the radical change was a kind of change that's really happening all over this country, albeit at a slower rate. I think of Clarkston as sort of America on fast forward.
With regard to having your own school and your own tutoring and a team comprised of the young men that it is, Mr. St. John talked earlier about assimilation and a melting pot and all that. Is that a concern for you that over the years, if the fellows stay in their own group, that there will be difficulty as they graduate from high school and go to college or go into occupations, that they're more used to being with their own fellows over the years rather than moving into the community at large?
They live in the community, so their time with us is not 24/7. And part of it is that healing process, that time where they need to come to this country and adjust. And I'm not even talking about adjusting as refugees. Let's talk about just adjusting as immigrants. It's really tough to come to this country. And so I think the way our program works is we empower them, we make them feel proud of who they are, and we give them a sound education so they can integrate into college, which is the ultimate integration and the ultimate American dream. So it's not isolation, but empowerment.
I'd like to say something about that as well. I think one of the things I noticed in my reporting, and you'll read a lot about this in the book, is that the stress that I saw was among refugee boys wasn't things that they talked about in their past. It was what was happening every day. And what was happening, we've all been preteens or teenagers. It's a pretty rocky time under the best of circumstances. And what I repeatedly saw was kids who wanted to fit in. They wanted to be accepted by their peers. They wanted to belong. So they go to school. They adopt American customs, and they start to dress American and speak American. And then they go home, and mom or dad says, we don't walk around with our shirts untucked in Africa. You tuck your shirt in. Or that's not how we wear our hair where we come from. And so I saw kids trying to negotiate this space between these two worlds where at school American kids might think they were different because they had an accent or they didn't know what country they came from, never heard of it. And then they go home and they get a little bit of the same but from a different direction. And what I saw that was sort of miraculous with the Fugees was it was this one place that kids could go where everyone was so different that there was no normal that people were trying to fit into or aspire to. Everyone was different, and it was just understood that individuals are radically different from each other. And so everyone's different, so let's move on. And I think that in that safe space where people are not trying hard to fit in constantly, that's where confidence blossoms. That's where people get relaxed. And I saw kids, when I first showed up with my notebook, who didn't speak a word of English, who were very shy, very withdrawn, and by the end of the very season I reported on, were shouting commands in English to their fellow defenders during a game. And now one of those players is tutoring English to newcomers, whereas when 2006 in the fall when I showed up, I don't think he spoke a word of English. So I think that could be a concern, but you have to have a base of confidence and self-esteem, I think, before you can reasonably expect to connect with others. And I was impressed with the way the Fugees provided that opportunity.
I really appreciate, Warren St. John, your characterization of the mistakes that are often made and in trying to meld these things together. And it is a very difficult thing. And as a member of the resettlement community, I'm very sensitive to how difficult the process is. And for that reason, this idea of community is really significant to me. And while on the one hand, I'm thrilled with what the Fugees have brought, on the other hand, I am concerned about the tensions that the Fugees have created in the community. And I'm wondering, Luma, if you could comment on mistakes that you think you've made in that process.
Can you comment specifically about the tensions that are there between the Fugees and the community right now?
Well, you spoke earlier about the field issue, and I've heard a lot of different rumors about that issue, and I would just love to hear it from your own mouth what you think the issue is.
Well, I was talking about the issue being minuscule compared to everything else that we deal with, and I was also talking about this happening 2 years ago. So since this incident has happened, we have been practicing at Milam Park, at Homestead Field, 4 days a week. And we do our home games at Ashford Dunwoody because that's the regulation size game. Do you want to?
Yeah, I would just say also that a lot of that stuff that came out in the Times article, the Times article was a snapshot in time. That was fall of 2006. I filed my story the day before Christmas, and then made a few changes a week later when there was other news to add. But I think if you'll see in the book, and that's what the book is all about, and I think that's what this evening is about, things aren't stagnant. And I know personally that people who, when I was reporting, had no particular interest in the Fugees in Clarkston, you might call them sort of old guard, are involved and supportive of the program in active ways now. And that's just, when I talked earlier about our country's remarkable ability to improvise its way out of the most complicated of social situations, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And there's no neat the end to this story. The story is. And so there'll always be headaches. But I think one thing that's definitely true is there's a lot more communication going, because I think maybe people feel a little bit more free to express their own frustrations and opinions as a result of the conversation that's been ongoing.
Well, thanks for writing the story.
Thanks.
I'm going to say is step out of your comfort zone. And so many times we think, oh, this problem's too big, that problem's too big. I'm just one person. What can I do? Well, look at what Ms. Muffler's done. She was just one person. And the impact, Ms. Muffler, I always get so emotional, but the impact you already have made, and the long-term impact you are making on the lives of these boys is just going to be like a pebble in the pond, and all the ripple effects are going to continue forever. And one thing we learned at our church was we had two choices. We could board up our doors and move out like many did, or we could stay and minister to who God sent us. We chose the latter. And one thing we have learned is that a smile is the same in every language. So please step out of your comfort zone. Thank you.
Refugee families obviously have come from extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and while in my reporting, I sensed a great sense of gratitude to be in a place that was safe and to be away from immediate harm. They faced extraordinary economic challenges, but also more subtle and pervasive day-to-day challenges, like how do we fit in this new place? How do we find a place of our own in this society? How do we become part of this community? And I found when I was reporting that while there was a great deal of guardedness about newcomers in Clarkston for obvious reasons, I think their experience makes the threshold for trusting other people quite high, there was also a real curiosity about meeting an actual American. Here they were in the middle of America, and meeting someone who was just a local, or maybe not from around here, but a local in the most general sense, was fairly rare because the apartment complexes housed so many foreigners, or they never had a chance to converse with the Americans who were around. People were busy going about their daily business, commuting, worrying about their own families, and that sort of thing. And so I came up with this image when I was writing of sort of fish and birds looking at each other, but in separate worlds and unable to cross over to each other's worlds to communicate. And I think that's maybe the best context in which to understand the broader story that I've written about. I think, as I said earlier, that I think it's important because this is where our country's headed. In certain big cities around America, like New York where I live, this is kind of the norm. We're used to meeting people from all over. And we've kind of figured out how to do that. But in most other places, like in Birmingham where I grew up, it's still fairly rare to actually interact with someone who's from another culture. They're there, you see them, but you may not speak to them. You may not actually encounter them and have a one-on-one conversation. And I think that's what ended up happening in Clarkston. I think there was a bit of an irony, at least as far as the Fugees go, in that there was so much similarity between what Luma was teaching the kids and what she is teaching the kids, and the values that we all in this country hold dear, or claim to hold dear: sense of personal responsibility, self-reliance, a work ethic, a willingness to help other people. This is the message that I saw Luma drilling into her players day in and day out. And I know those are values that an older resident in town would hold dear as well. But because of this fish and birds quality of life in this town, there is a precious little opportunity to find that common ground. And I think ultimately that's what this book is about. It's about people powering through those difficulties and improvising their way towards understanding. And I think in some ways that's the great American story. That's what we've done for our history. It's just sometimes when you're very close to it and very close to the action, it's hard to see that that's what's going on, that the mistakes people make, the fears that people express, are actually clumsy attempts to protect their own safety while still giving room for other people to have their lives in respectful ways.
Why did you decide to write the book?
My wife keeps asking me that question. I decided to write the book because I felt that that I had the kind of rarest of things for a reporter, and that is a story that was personal and touching and could draw you in emotionally, but that was also very important. And by that I mean, I think the lessons of what's happening in this little town down the road apply to all of our lives, and the connections, the way that the Fugees, kids from completely different cultures and backgrounds and religions who didn't speak the same languages, the way they figure out how to connect, and the framework that Luma provides offers all of us some guidance on how we might do it. And I think the thing that I really liked personally about Luma and reporting was that she never claimed to have a system of answers where everything was sort of neatly figured out. These are people just trying their best to make a complicated situation work. And I think you could use that line to describe our country's history. This place shouldn't really work the way it does. We're just from too many different places, and we have too many different interests. And somehow it does, and it's this grand, incredibly nurturing environment where people can express themselves. And so I saw in the Fugees story something that could teach us something, but something that might also touch people emotionally. And so that's why I decided to write the book.
And how long has the Fugees been in existence?
So this is my 10th season with the team, and our organization has been around for 3 years now.
Thank you both. Thank you, Luma, for your compassion and just for your commitment. And thank you, Warren, for bringing attention to the story. My question is about the community's reaction. And I guess as a reporter, in your experience in covering the story, what has made you cynical about the community's reaction? What has given you optimism kind of going forward for our country in terms of integrating?
Sure. Well, I'd say nothing's made me cynical, and I think there's a lot of cause for optimism. I mean, I think that's my default position anyway, as a citizen of the world, and I think that's probably reflected in my work. But as I said, I parachuted into, in the book I talk about this study by. Just give me 1 second to be a little bit academic, because I think it's important. There's a study by a Harvard political scientist named Bob Putnam who sent his researchers out to some of the most diverse communities in America. And he had them ask people questions about their lives. And what they found after interviewing 35,000 people was that people who live in extremely diverse communities are less likely to vote. They watch more hours of TV than the average American. They're more cynical about the media. less trusting of politicians. They're less likely to be involved in community matters. And when the study came out, I think it was a sort of wake-up call, because in a way it's not surprising. If you can't connect with your neighbors, what are you going to do? You might watch a little TV. You might hang out behind the closed door of your apartment or your home. And as I read the Putnam study, and I talked to some of the older residents of Clarkston, one of them, a city council member, I may even be here, said to me that when she moved to Clarkston, it was a community where people weren't coming out of their houses, weren't talking to each other. And it's this isn't anyone's fault. This isn't about someone being, making mistakes or being bad people. This is just a fact of the difficulty of living in a diverse community. How do you talk to someone you can't talk to? How do you make them understand you? And so what's really cool about the Fugees is you can clearly do it. And we've got an example every time they take the field of people communicating with each other in various ways. And there are other examples in Clarkston. I talk in the book about Thrift Town, the grocery store, or the International Bible Church of Clarkston. The old Clarkston Baptist Church, founded in 1880, is now this crazy, diverse congregation where African women in beautiful, colorful dress are sitting next to little sweet Southern ladies in their 80s and 90s. Yes, they argue about music. Yes, there's some difficulty about what the potluck dinner is going to look like. But it basically works, and people feel good about it. But you're never going to get to that point if you don't get out of the apartment. And I think, the message of my book, not to be too didactic about it. I'm a reporter. We cringe at anything didactic. But I think it's hard. It was hard for me after my reporting not to feel inspired about the possibilities for connecting. Because, and I'll say one other thing about that. I spoke to someone here, actually saw her in the audience. Won't single her out, but she was talking to me about her work with Sudanese refugees. And she said that the work took her out of her comfort zone. I think I heard this the first week I was in Clarkston. I didn't really know what that meant. What does it mean to get out of your comfort zone? And then I got an understanding of what that meant. When you're immersed in a world where everyone's different, you don't know if the things you're saying are polite or offensive to someone else in their culture. You second guess yourself. You get tentative. It can be uncomfortable if you're not with someone who's exactly like you. But that's okay. That's not a terrible thing. It's only a terrible thing if you let that paralyze you into not ever engaging with other people. And so I think the story of the Fugees, for me, was kind of a kick in the pants to get out there, talk to people who look different, sound different, and I hope that's what people take away from it.
That was just all over the place. And I'd given them positions at the beginning, and he wasn't holding his position. But I didn't know his name because he was one of 30 kids that came out that day. And I tried to get his attention. I couldn't get it. And finally asked Noor, one of the Afghan kids I knew. I was like, Noor, what's his name? And he looked at me and looked at him and then turned around and grinned. He's like, that's One Shoe. I'm like, that's One Shoe. And I look over, and this kid has one huge oversized sneaker on. And and that was One Shoe. And he played like crazy, not a care in the world, didn't care he didn't have any shoes or any cleats or anything, and came off the field after practice was over, wiped down this huge shoe that was too big for him, and put it in his backpack, and then put his flip-flops on and got ready to walk 2 miles home. He was 8 years old. And I looked down at my brand new kangaroo leather cleats that I had just ordered for my new season, never more ashamed in my life, and put them away that night, promising never to pull them out until all my kids could wear the same cleats I could. And it was a series of events like this that led me to where I am today. We started a tutoring program and partnered with RISA to start it off, and got involved with the kids' families, and sorry, this is new to me. Got involved with their families and figured out what their needs were. the way we approach things, the way I approach things. I don't go in with a master plan of how to do things. I don't read in a textbook or in some academic book, oh, this is how you need to deal with diversity or kids from different countries or teenage boys. I go in and learn, and they teach us. And they teach us which direction to go and what they need. And so from the soccer teams, we went to having tutoring, to starting our own school, because a lot of our kids were failing in the public school system. And that's the way we're going to continue to grow.